I'm Gail Rubin, the doyen of death, author of A Good Goodbye, Funeral Planning for Those Who Don't Plan to Die, Hail and Farewell, Cremation Ceremonies, Templates and Tips, and Kicking the Bucket List, 100 Downsizing and Organizing Things to Do Before You Die. My motto is just like talking about sex won't make you pregnant, talking about funerals and end of life issues won't make you dead. And I am very pleased that we have a sensitive topic that we are going to talk about with emotionally naked honesty with Ann Moss Rogers. Let's face it, talking about suicide is tough. A loss by suicide, it's like no other, and it's very hard to talk about. People are especially vulnerable in their grief. Ann Moss Rogers is a TEDx speaker. She's a storyteller, a writer. She's a certified suicide prevention trainer, and she helps foster connection to prevent suicide. She helps reduce substance misuse and helps people find life after loss. Her blog is called Emotionally Naked, and it tackles the topics of suicide and its triggers, addiction and mental illness, and grief. And her book, Diary of a Broken Mind, is an International Book Award finalist. Welcome, Ann Moss Rogers.
Oh, thank you for having me so much. I really appreciate it, Gail.
This is going to be a great conversation. And before we even start talking about suicide, let's talk about this terminology. Died by suicide is the preferred way to say it rather than committed suicide. And I know I'm guilty of using that phrase and trying to change, but why is this change in the works?
So you can use the phrase killed himself, died by suicide, he suicided, but the reason we want to remove commit from that phrase is it's from the 1400s England when suicide was actually a crime. And y'all are probably thinking, well, how did they punish somebody for that? What they did is they punished the family. So they would actually tie the body to a horse and drag it through town is kind of an example of shaming people for the suicide in the family. And then all the worldly goods were donated to the crown. The family wasn't allowed to have that inheritance. And they were also denied the right to a funeral and a burial in the cemetery. And so that stuck in our lexicon for hundreds of years. And so now a lot of states in the United States, even though it has no statutes attached to it, it is still on the books as a crime, even though you can't charge anybody for a suicide or execute any of that these days. But we are trying to get it off the books because it is very stigmatizing, especially those who struggle with thoughts of suicide, to continue to use the word committed. So you'll see the major news outlets, Washington Post, New York Times, and NPR, all using it correctly. And you'll notice some of the smaller publications still haven't quite gotten the news, but it's going to take a while since it's been in our language for such a long time. Suicide is a public health issue, not unlike diabetes or heart disease, and it is recognized as such from the American Foundation of Suicide Prevention, from the World Health Organization, the National Institute of Mental Health, and the Department of Defense. Public health issue, not a crime.
Well, it's interesting because I know the Jewish tradition, and I think the Catholic tradition as well, that if someone died by suicide, they could not be buried in a consecrated burial ground. The Jews would put criminals and suicides outside the consecrated Jewish burial ground and still give them a burial. But yeah, it's a punishment on the family.
Yes, it is. And for many years, therapists would also make contracts with their patients But that's a misunderstanding of what suicide is, which is it's this irrational state of mind. And Gail, if you go ahead and put up that visual that I sent you with the two peaks on it, this kind of explains what suicide is. And it is not exactly like this for everyone. However, this is how many people have described to me their suicidal thoughts and suicidal ideation. And so this is kind of your average irrational suicidal thinking moment, so to speak, which lasts maybe about 20 minutes. And it has two peaks. And in that time, you have where the thoughts are so intense and they're more than likely to take their life, or the risk is higher. And then it kind of drops off, and then they're more ambivalent about death, and they're not sure of it, and they're more afraid it's going to hurt, and so on. And then it goes back up to another peak, usually higher than the first, and they struggle more with those thoughts, and then they kind of come out of it. And when people come out of that, so I think of it as a trance. It's all of a sudden they can feel whether it's warm or cold, and you can tell the difference. It's kind of like before, I'm a terrible person, I'm a burden, I need to do this, but I'm so worthless. And then when they come out of it, they're like, gosh, it's cold out here. And I've actually been talking to somebody on a bridge, and it was 15 degrees and she couldn't feel that cold, but as soon as she started to complain that it was cold, I knew she was coming out of it. So it's kind of like a trance or a brain attack, and it has a limited amount of time.
What brought you to this field? What is your experience with suicide?
Well, in 2010, I started with youth mental health because my youngest son was struggling with, I didn't know what. And later I would find out it was depression. But he was very, very creative. But then, the ADHD, and then the fact he couldn't sleep at night. I mean, insomnia at a young age. And then later he was diagnosed with depression. So in 2010, a lot of things started to escalate. My son started to use drugs and alcohol, and I thought, oh my gosh, I'm a terrible parent. Haven't we had these conversations? But what was happening to him is he was struggling with thoughts of suicide. And to make those thoughts of suicide go away, he would take drugs and alcohol. And he's like, this works. Why? How could it be wrong? Isn't taking a drug or using alcohol better than killing myself? So I can understand his thought process from the standpoint of a teenager. Flash forward, he ends up many, many years later becoming addicted to heroin. And that's not where anybody starts, right? They start with alcohol and that doesn't work. And then they go to pot. Oh, this is amazing. And it doesn't have the same effect. They keep graduating to a different drug, more drugs. And then he finally gets to heroin, and man, that makes him feel like the king. And to a depressed kid, who can resist that? Now, what's odd is Charles is the funniest, most popular kid in the school. So I'm not seeing these signs of depression. If anything, Charles was hypersocial, and he wasn't withdrawing from friends. Now his friends changed. So he's become addicted to heroin. He goes to detox, he goes to rehab, he goes to a recovery home, and he relapses within 24 hours. They take him back to detox, and he sees a friend there, and he walks out. So for 2 weeks, we don't really know where he is. We got some spotty communication here and there from text messages. And my husband and I are having dinner, and we get a phone call from the police. And I remember thinking, oh, he's been arrested. This is such great news. And then logic started to weave its way through my head. And I'm like, they don't come tell you that your 19-year-old is in jail. Actually, he just turned 20. they're coming to tell me my child is dead. And so in the back of a police car in a parking lot, we got the worst news of our lives. And the policeman told us that our child had died by suicide and the method left no question. And so I ended up selling my digital marketing business and focusing on the subjects that nobody wants to talk about.
Wow. So what do you see as the reasons that people kill themselves?
I think that a lot of times you'll look at headlines in the newspaper and it'll say, child was bullied, kills herself or himself. And one thing we need to understand is that people have to be vulnerable to thoughts of suicide. People with underlying mental illness or trauma, PTSD, often are more vulnerable to thoughts of suicide than the rest of humanity. But it isn't unusual in most person's entire lifetime to have a moment where you're thinking, you know, a quick exit wouldn't be a bad idea. So the majority of people have had that thought at one time, but people who struggle with those thoughts consistently usually have an underlying mental health problem. In my son's case, he was going through withdrawal. He was in a major depressive episode. He thought we had given up on him, when in fact, you know, we were trying to play out this tough love thing, which, you know, I really regret. And, you know, probably 5 other reasons that my son died by suicide. And it wasn't just one thing, and it never is. It's health history and environment. So it's kind of all that conglomeration of your family history, your health history, and whatever's happening in your life right now.
And I would think it's to escape pain.
Yeah, and so people, so let's say you're in a room and you're on fire, and there's a bucket of water right next to you. Most people are going to say, I'm on fire, that's a bucket of water, that'll stop the fire. And they take the bucket of water and they pour it over them. It's similar with thoughts of suicide because they're experiencing this awful, crushing emotional pain, and their brain is lying to them and telling them, you need to die, you're just worthless. And if they have means nearby in order to complete the task, that increases their risk. So that's why a lot of times with certain people will say remove means. So if somebody owns a firearm, can you let another firearm owning family, you know, babysit that firearm while you are in this state of mind, just until you can kind of get back on your feet, basically. So if there is no availability of a way to end your life, most people aren't going to follow through with it. But if there is something available, they often will. So what we want to do is put time between thoughts and action. So the more time you put between thoughts and action, the higher probability that person's life could be saved.
Well, you know, I think the prevalence of suicide is probably greater than most of us recognize. I know personally within my own life, there was a funeral director friend of mine who died by suicide, and a cousin of my dad's generation died by suicide. And you're left with the question, why? So many question marks surround it when that touches your life. And by the way, I'd like to ask our audience if you've had an experience of someone you know or in your family or someone you love had committed suicide. I'd be interested in just hearing.
Died by suicide.
Sorry, I'm trying.
It's been in our language for so long. I am not word shaming you, I promise.
So what are some of the wrong things that people would say when someone does die by suicide to the surviving family or
Oh, he's in a better place.
friends?
There is nowhere better for my son than right next to me on Thanksgiving Day, and not in heaven. And at first, I will admit that I was angry, and at times I wanted to lash out and say, I tell you what, we'll send all your loved ones to a better place and see how you like it. and and we joked in a bereavement group. We love to tell those jokes with each other. We never say it out loud, because one thing I made the decision of early on, and maybe not right at the beginning, was that if somebody said something, to give them credit for having the courage to say anything at all. Because number one, I lost a child. Number two, I lost a child to suicide. Number three, I had a child with mental illness and drug addiction who died. A lot of stigma around all of those issues. And it takes the other person a whole lot of courage to say anything. So what offended me the most is when they said nothing at all, or they looked physically ill when they ran into me, or they would purposefully avoid me, because I'm a very social person, and it made me feel like such a pariah to get up the nerve to go in the grocery store or the drugstore again and be avoided. You know, I mean, I wanted to be hugged. I wanted to talk about my child. And then I would run into people and I would talk about my child, and people would cut me off mid-sentence. And they would start talking about something else. And it made me feel like they were erasing my child from my family tree. And I didn't like that. And that's when I wrote a newspaper article about our family story that ended up going viral. I wanted this subject to be discussed, because what my son said prior to his suicide could have been the bullet points under the phrase, what do people thinking of suicide say? And I didn't know, because I wasn't educated and it wasn't on my radar until he died. And we need to get it on people's radar before that happens.
Well, what are some of those signs? What are people saying before they might kill themselves by suicide?
My son, one of his tweets was, if I died, no one would notice for 30 days. If you want to know who really cares about you, see who's there when you have nothing. Another one was, death sounds nice. And you'd think, I'm a mom, I'm seeing this, I might be worried. I didn't see all of them, for one thing. I was blocked off of his social media at the time. I saw one of them hours before his last phone call, and I couldn't quite put my head around it. And it was the one about, if I died, no one would notice for 30 days. To me, I thought, oh, he's about to hit rock bottom and ask for help. Because we as parents think that ask for help is going to be in a box tied with a pretty bow. Hey, mom, can I have help? It's usually blubbering, ugly, desperate. They don't know how to put it into words kind of plea. And I just didn't recognize, when in that last phone call to me, my son was asking me for help. And I just didn't recognize it. And I've forgiven myself for that. And that has taken quite a bit of grief work to get there.
So what are some helpful things that people can say or do, especially if they're concerned about someone who might try to take their own lives?
I think if you hear people saying, I'm a burden, I can't do this anymore, you know, things would be better if I just weren't here anymore. you stop for a minute and you will feel something in your gut. Now, grieving people are at higher risk for suicide. So I need to put that out there. And parents who've lost a child to any cause of death are usually 30% of them, 33% of them are considering suicide.
Wow.
So I think, what was your question again? Because I got off on a tangent.
Well, so what are some of the things that one should say rather than not say to?
I think to the grieving parent or to the person who's struggling. So
Yeah.
first of all, to the person who is struggling, tell me more. What we want to say to a struggling person is, you have so much to live for. How could you think that? What about your handsome husband? Or, you're so rich. Or that invalidates people's feelings. It's just smarter to say, that sounds serious. Tell me more, and ask questions. Have you thought about how you would do this? And you want to make note of it if you ask that question, but that's okay to ask that question. What I didn't know is people who are struggling with thoughts of suicide do want to tell. And I didn't know that. I thought that they were so committed to the idea that they were trying to keep it secret. But typically, they'll drop a lot of hints because they want you to ask. So if they say, I just want to end it all, this sounds serious. A lot of times people going through a divorce or suffering with grief have thoughts of suicide. Are you thinking of suicide? And you ask that question directly. You don't say, are you going to harm yourself? You ask, are you thinking of suicide? Are you thinking of killing yourself? Because they need to know that you're willing to engage in this uncomfortable conversation. And when you use those key phrases, you're saying, yeah, it's an uncomfortable conversation, but I'm willing to have that conversation with you now. And what do you say to bereaved parents? I don't know that it's as much of what you say. When people would say, I have no idea what to say, I'm just heartbroken for you. That was really nice. Even some of the cliche phrases of, you have my condolences, because like I said, it takes a lot of courage for people to say anything. The best things were intentional. Like, I don't know what to say, but your grass is tall. I have a lawnmower and I could be over at 10 a.m. on Saturday to cut your grass. Is that a good time for you? So being very intentional in your giving back. The kids still have to go to soccer practice. The dog still has to go out for a walk. The family still has to eat. Our world has stopped. We wonder why the world has the audacity to keep spinning on its axis without our loved one in it. But the world keeps going forward and people need to pick up prescriptions. And that intentional work is very helpful, because I remember I could barely take a shower. I would get out of bed and I couldn't remember the order. I almost got in the shower with my glasses and pajamas on. So remembering the steps was just really difficult. I mean, you have kind of grief brain or grief fog. And it was so devastating, because I was also struggling with all those coulda, woulda, shouldas, which is part of the process with any death, but more pronounced with suicide death.
Yeah. Is there any other point you'd like to make, Ann Moss, before we open it up to questions with the audience?
I think that there are people who can and are people who struggle with sitting with people in their pain. And I found that to be the case among my friends. and to find that group of people that could support me. Like I went to a suicide loss support group, best idea ever. And then I kind of decided to educate that group of friends of mine of what I wanted to do, because they didn't call me for the first 6 months thinking I wanted to be alone. And I felt abandoned. And what I wish I had done is gotten one of those friends, spoken to one of them about how I was feeling, how I wanted to be included in invitations, even if I bailed at the last minute, because I wanted to feel included, even if I didn't go. And I recommend to other people that they do sit down with that one friend. And I even have a worksheet to kind of go over a lot of talking points of when do you want to talk about, because we don't know what somebody else feels like. I mean, I wanted a house full of people. Not everybody wants that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I think at this point we can open it up for questions. So if you want to unmute yourself or raise your hand. Oh, I see. Could you share the worksheet? We do have some
I have a
materials to share
file.
with you. Yeah.
Yeah, at the end where it says file in the chat box, I've got a leave behind, and there's a link to that worksheet in that leave behind.
Oh, good. There's one question I'd like to kick it off with is medical aid in dying being branded as doctor-aided suicide. My friend Mary Kay Brady, I see, is here on this call, and I talk with Mary Kay very often about the medical aid in dying in New Mexico. We don't have that here where I'm based, but there are a few states that do have that, and that can be a blessing for people who are facing a terminal illness that could be very painful.
Right.
Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, they call it assisted suicide, and there is no such thing as that phrase. But that's what when we went to try to go to the legislature to get the phrase, to get suicide as a crime taken off the books, it has no statutes on it. But they kept using that phrase, assisted suicide. And I said, that's not what it is. Suicide as a loan act is completely different and separate from that. And they kept trying to lump it together, and it's just completely different. I mean, and then I'm like, I can't debate that right now. I'm here to debate that, the Department of Defense recognizes that suicide is a crime and we need to take it off the books. Why are you introducing all this, this other stuff that is a whole different issue? And, I do feel like we allow our animals to go when they're in pain. And, I feel like we should allow human beings to do that. But it's not the same. It's not a suicide.
Yeah.
It's just not the same.
Mary Kay, did you want to speak up about that?
Yes. Medical aid in dying has absolutely nothing in common with suicide. Absolutely nothing. People that are utilizing medical aid in dying want to live. They want to be alive, but they are living with intractable pain or terminal illness, and they use the medical aid in dying to free themselves. The person that is considering death by suicide wants to be dead. So it is totally, totally different.
Now, I will say that in that 20 minutes that I showed, they want to die and then they're ambivalent about death. So it's more complicated than that. But you're right, Mary Kate. The two are completely...
They're completely different.
Right.
totally different. And it is just whether they want to put physician in front of it or whatever. They're two totally isolated different things. Sorry, Gail, that's my soapbox.
That's okay.
I agree completely. And when people blend it together, I'm like, they're not the same. That's like saying oranges are the same as apples because they're
right.
Both come from trees.
Right.
Other questions, comments, stories you want to share?
I'm going to check out the chat box here too.
This is Ellen. I was just going to say, you know, where Mary Kay said someone who's thinking of suicide, they want to be dead. I don't agree with that necessarily. They're thinking about it, but they don't want to be dead. They just want the pain to stop. And they think that's the only way. So
right.
That's my 2 cents on it anyway.
And most people don't want to die. And I have a page that is visited by almost 5,000 people a month from Google, and they're looking up a specific way to die. And most of them will say that. I just want this pain to stop, and I don't know of any other way. And in that irrational moment, you can't say, yes, there is another way. You just have to kind of acknowledge the pain and let them talk and ask questions. And you wouldn't say, well, what about your mother and your father and your sister? They'll never get over this. That's not the time to bring that up. But if they mention a loved one, you say, well, you know, why don't you tell me a little bit about your sister? So you're triggering that nugget, but you're not saying, you know, what about them? Because you're implying that they're selfish and that they should feel shame. And that's the last thing we want to do with somebody struggling with thoughts of suicide. We want to make them feel heard, and they need an empathetic listener.
And Vanna has her hand raised.
Okay, I'm Vana, and just to let you know that I am a person who stutters, so there will be some pauses and blocks. It's not because of grief, although grief does exacerbate it. My story is that, and again, I can speak for myself. My daughter suffered from anxiety and depression and attempted suicide when she was 14. She went to residential treatment program and came back and thought she was doing well, and she had been excuse me, sneaking alcohol and dabbed into some marijuana and all of that stuff. And I think it's just to allow her to be able to function. And I think like what Anne said, to also have the thoughts of completing, or the thoughts of suicide to go away. And we were extremely close. My family was extremely close. Her brother was extremely close to her. And when when her illness was more pronounced, he developed anxiety and depression because he was so worried about her, and we were so worried about her. And she passed away of a drug overdose in September 6th of last year. So it'll be a year in a week or so. And she was just 3 weeks shy of turning 17. And I do think that suicide is underreported because she was listed as accidental overdose, but my feeling is that I think it was suicide because I think that she saw us so worried about her. And she was a very deeply, deeply caring person. And she would always like tell me like, I, I don't want to, burden. Like she would always say like, I'm trying to be a good daughter. And she would say things like that. So a big part of me believes that she completed suicide because she wanted to relieve us, because she saw how worried we were and how we just desperately wanted to support her. So thank you for allowing me to share my story.
Well, first of all, I'm so sorry because September's coming up and that grief anniversary, the first one, is difficult. In fact, I found anticipating it more difficult than the actual day. And my son didn't die by overdose. His method left no question, but they believe that of the overdoses that probably at least 25% of them are intentional, but unless they leave a note, they'll rule it an accidental overdose. But the drug use makes it all worse. What makes them feel better at first ends up making them worse. So when I go into schools and speak, I talk about healthy and unhealthy coping strategies, because I'm not even sure our young people know the difference between one or the other. And based on the workshops I've done, they're not that aware of that. Like, a lot of them will say, well, retail therapy's good. And I'll ask them a lot of questioning on that, because they think they're going and spending a lot of money. If it makes you feel good, it's okay. But, even if you're eating a lot of ice cream, you could, gain 100 pounds, and that's not a healthy coping strategy. So it's finding the tools that work for that person. For me, it was writing. I wrote on this blog, Emotionally Naked, at first 2 times a day for about 2 years. And now it's about 5 to 6 times a week. And then I wrote a book and I wrote articles, and giving back has been what helps me heal. And that writing is a part of it. Doing events like this is a part of it. And I didn't realize that at first. I just started doing it. And then I realized I was probably getting more back than I was putting out there. And having all these groups really, it just helped me move forward at a time I didn't know that was possible. So thank you so much for sharing the story about your daughter. It's a really, really rough loss because it is so stigmatized.
Mara Robbins has raised her hand. And
Yes,
go ahead.
thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. I deeply appreciate the service that you're offering to all of us. It's very meaningful and very timely for me. And I've been thinking a lot about some of the things you've mentioned about taking action in regards to, like, I didn't realize about committing suicide. Like, that's a big leap for me, and it makes a lot of sense. And that you approached legislators about various things, like to make it suicide not illegal anymore. And I'm wondering about some of the best ways to take action, because I truly believe that taking action in the face of grief is one of the ways in which we heal. And what I've found in the aftermath of a dear friend's suicide at the end of May is that most everyone involved in any way is suffering at this point. And some people are suffering from suicidal ideation. Some people are suffering from, well, she did it. How do we know that she didn't want us to? People are suffering from the continued isolation of COVID. And people are suffering because if we don't have somewhere to channel our grief and our rage, then it can just eat us alive. So I guess my questions to you are, what are some of the most effective ways to do that? Because one of the things we found is that the police officers that came to her home in the wake of her suicide were ridiculously unprepared, ineffective, and made things worse. They were not equipped to help us. And that's one of the things that I've wanted to do with a trauma group I'm working with locally, is simply to provide some sort of resources for them to give to people who are left in the aftermath of that, are left with what's left, and sometimes, you know, dealt with by authorities, not trained social workers, you know, that sort of thing. So any guidance you can provide on how we can use our grief to take action would be greatly appreciated.
So what you're looking for, and most survivors are looking for this, is you look back at your life and you want it to have purpose, and you want your loved one to have stood for something or meant something. And that's the legacy you want to carry forward. So we start to live a more authentic life as a result. And I think that's actually the gift. Finding what your purpose is takes some patience. Because right away we want to dive into whatever that purpose is. And sometimes we go for a purpose that we can't sustain for a long period of time, but it helps in that moment. Like a friend of mine who lost her son to suicide, absolutely dove headfirst into Lock and Talk. And Lock and Talk is to keep firearms and out of the hands of young people or people who are at risk.
Hey, y'all go. How you doing?
And
Good morning.
it's a really good thing for her to kind of dive into at the time. Another friend of mine has started a support group. There are several legislative things through American Foundation of Suicide Prevention, and you can actually get involved with them if you want to get into the political arena. American Foundation also has some training for starting a suicide loss support group, and that is a way to give back. They have kind of a place you can start called Healing Conversations. You can volunteer and get on a list of people you can speak with. So let's say you're 2 years out from having lost someone to suicide. Then you can get on this list, and somebody 2 hours from you in the same state wants to get on a Zoom call with somebody to talk about her brother who just killed himself last week. So that's another way to give back. That finding your purpose, your big purpose, it's going to change and evolve over time. So you need to allow for that. But if you don't have that thing right away, I always encourage people, be patient. Just say that purpose is going to find you. You want to find it, therefore it will reappear, but give it some time to marinate, because a grief brain can't always come up with just the right thing. And we need to be really 2 years out to be able to truly be able to look at it more objectively. Because at first we're still going through the anger and the sadness. It doesn't mean you can't do anything. It's just that, like, they don't really want people speaking to high schools, you know, within a year after losing a child to suicide, for example, because there's just a lot to learn of what to say and what not to say, because it's a vulnerable population. I think because you want to find your purpose, you will. And I'm trying to think of the Jason Flat Act. And that is an act of getting everybody trained in schools, I believe, And then with first responders here in Richmond, Virginia, what we've done is we've paired those officers with CIT trained individuals. Ultimately, I would like to see police not be answering mental health calls at all. That the CIT trained people be going in, because I mean, they're the ones that are qualified. And in maybe certain such situations, the policemen do. In 2 of our counties, we have 80% of our officers trained in mental health approach, which takes a week of their time. I mean, it's a full week of training of different strategies they use. And at first they didn't want to do it. So training that first wave of officers was really difficult. That doesn't work. They're all tough guys. I mean, there's some women, but most of them are men. But when they went away and they used some of these strategies and they came back and like were telling their stories, then the officers were jumping in and couldn't wait to dive in and try some of these strategies. Because what they found is that it de-escalated crisis. And, you know, throwing somebody on the ground and putting handcuffs on them doesn't de-escalate a crisis. It makes everybody mad and creates, you know, viral videos. But learning to say something in the heat of the moment and not getting in the heat of the moment yourself as an officer and learning what to say and do, they thought this is magic. So it went from them having to sit at the hospital for 7 hours with any mental health patient to them having to spend maybe an hour and to be able to hand it over to a crisis intervention team. So I think if that's your purpose, going with the first responder route and look up crisis and I think it's crisis and training, CIT, but look for that officer training, and having that in our communities would be huge.
That's great. And other questions, comments? I'm seeing lots of great information in the chat box going on.
You got to send me the chat afterwards. You have to download it and read all the comments.
Okay. Somebody's saying the Alliance of Hope for Suicide Loss Survivors is a really good resource.
I wanted to thank you, Anne and Gail, for your very thoughtful and explicit response. And it's good to know that these crisis intervention teams are being built, and I will definitely follow up on this. I also think that there's often an intersection between what Mary Kay was mentioning and, you know, more, I don't know exactly how to say this correctly, like classic suicidal ideations. Like, for instance, with my friend Laura, she suffered from a traumatic brain injury and lived with chronic pain. So part of, I think, her suicide was prompted by not feeling like she could live with the pain that she was having to endure. And though I do understand there's a difference, I think it's been difficult for some of us to differentiate, just because many people who die by suicide do so because they're suffering so greatly from something.
A lot of people who have TBI will develop suicidal thoughts. A lot of people who struggle with chronic pain, it can send them in that direction, and you know, it has an effect on their brain. People who've been exposed to trauma, you lose a leg, 2 legs, you become paralyzed. A lot of times your brain can't tell the difference between physical illness and mental illness. It's all cake batter to your brain. We kind of separate it. But when you're going through those really, really difficult times, people visit that in their head. They're like, they can't see what their life looks like. So I have found that when I do speak to students, I talk about their future, you know, and I encourage their teachers to do some of those tests that show them, you know, where they're special, you know, what they're good at, so they can see themselves in some kind of future occupation. Because sometimes it's the fact that people just don't see a future for themselves. And if you've suffered a traumatic brain injury or degenerative spine disease and you know it's not going to get better and that you're just going to be in pain for the rest of your life, I can't even fathom to speak on that. I mean, I can't put people down for it or pass judgment because I've never been in that spot. I've been in pain, but I've always known that something would get better. I'm a brain tumor survivor. But, I could see that something would be better after this thus and such surgery. And, I do have some permanent deficits, but they're not anything I can't live with. And I can tell you, I lost my voice for 1.5 years, and that very detrimental to me socially. Now, I didn't consider suicide, but I did get down. I mean, I was much more blue than I've ever been. And then I was able to go to a surgeon who restored it, and that made a huge difference in my mood. So all of those factors make a difference, and anybody is capable of having suicidal ideation. All of us at any time. They're just people who are, by virtue of genetics or something that's happened in their past, they're more vulnerable to it.
EM had her hand up, but put it down. So Ashley, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's not exactly a question, but I've suffered from depression, and I remember when I was being hospitalized, I was afraid to be hospitalized because I knew that on applications and things they would say, "Have you ever been hospitalized for mental health?" And I was afraid, like, well, I don't want to have to check that yes box on there. And so I'm better, I do well, but I think that my life goal is like to try to break the stigma that goes along with mental health issues and suicide. And I got this tattoo with the semicolon and the lotus flower. And I found that it's really helpful, actually. It's the only tattoo I ever had, and I never thought I'd get one, but some of the money went to a mental health organization. And so, but I thought that I found it's very helpful because people ask, well, what is that tattoo? And then it gives me the opportunity to bring up the conversation. I'm not suggesting everyone get a tattoo, but I just feel like anytime that we have the opportunity, even in social situations, to like bring it up and try to like break the cycle of, it's terrible how people think mental health issues are just someone's fault so I just wanted to share that.
I also wanted to put it out there, Emotionally Naked also presents your stories. So if anybody here wants to share a story about their loved one or about their depression, it's for people with lived experience and people who've lost someone or people that, struggle with thoughts of suicide, anything around that subject. Those stories, like you said, we're not going to be able to tackle this stigma without people hearing those personal stories. And I mean, you're functioning, Ashley. Our greatest writers and music composers suffer from depression. My son was a creative genius. So those mental illnesses come with amazing gifts, and we're not paying enough attention to that, and giving people credit. And also, depression is like any other disorder, like diabetes. I mean, it needs to be treated. And it doesn't need to be put in a category all by itself, the category of shame, because it is very hard to manage. I mean, it's something you have to keep on top of every single day.
Well, Ann Moss Rogers, this has been an amazing conversation, and thank you all for joining us today for this. We do have a leave behind, which I think I will email to you as a attachment, PDF, as well as a link to the video of this conversation, so that if you want to share it with others or just revisit the conversation again, you'll have that option. I did want to also let you know that this video will be made part of my upcoming Before I Die New Mexico festival, which will be a virtual festival, just like Reimagine is. We're holding it from October 30th to November 2nd, and we'll have panel discussions, book discussions, discussions about issues of downsizing and medical aid in dying, and we'll have theater and movies. And if you sign up for the VIP experience, we're having a Halloween party virtually that will be a lot of fun. So Before I Die, nm.com is the website for that, but we'll include information in our follow-up email to you on that. Any last thoughts, Ann Moss?
I am putting the link to my book in the chat. It just won an International Book Award finalist, which for a memoir about suicide is a pretty big deal. So I put the link in there. And the download or follow-up that you'll have has some free ebooks, including the worksheet, and just a basic what do you say or what do you do, and some comments. So it's not quite on one page, but it's almost on one page. Just some tips and highlights. And this has been great. I love having a conversation and seeing faces. Webinars are hard because I don't see people, and I like to see people.
So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. Live long and prosper.
Big hug from me to you.